It is a great pleasure and honor to have Louise von Vloten with us today. Professor von Vloten has been professor of translation study at the University of Ottawa in Canada since 1995. There she is also director of graduate studies at the École de Traduction et d'Interprétation and director of several major summer programs in translation and interpretation. She has an impressive publication record reflecting her broad research interests, which range from feminism and gender issues in translation, cultural diplomacy and translation, to audiovisual translation. She has been one of the pioneers in the field of women in translation, as we also saw yesterday, thanks to Pascal Sardin's presentation. So many of her books and articles on feminism have marked turning point in the discipline. In particular, I would like to mention Translation and Gender, Translation in the Era of Feminism, which appeared in 1997, and which was a seminal study that identified translation practices derived from experimental feminist writing, and also argued for openly intervention translation strategies. Other important works have appeared since then. I can't mention all of them, but I would like to mention at least Translating Women in 2011, Translating Women, Different Voice and New Horizon in 2016, co-edited with Farzaneh, okay. And most recently, the Routledge Handbook on Translation, Feminism and Gender in 2020. She's also a translator of literary text from German and French. She is deeply interested in post-colonialism, and she has been studied the significance of issues such as exile, migration, and diaspora. Her talk today is entitled Rivers of Language Across Oceans Towards Translating Exile, and she will offer an overview of the development of feminist and translation study, but also she will argue the need for a decolonial feminist approach. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Louise von Vloten.
Thank you for that detailed introduction. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to end up talking about this book, which just came out in Canada, in Toronto, entitled River in an Ocean. And it is a fantastic collection of 11 essays by women who translate and who write about translation, who all come from very different parts of the global south, so-called. They say the global majority. So it has articles in it by women who started out in Tamil Nadu, who started out in Sri Lanka, who started out in, or who come from, refer back to Rwanda, to Palestine, to Philippines. Really totally interesting new direction, for me at least, in regard to women's work in translation. So that's where I'm going to end up. And I've just written a review essay of this book, which is going to come out in a journal in the United States called Feminist Studies or something like that. I don't know, I can find it if someone's interested. So this talk will consist of two parts. Quickly, an overview of the development of feminist approaches, and I'm going to insist on that word, feminist approaches to and in translation and translation studies since about the 1980s. And second, more lengthy, a presentation of the current developments over the last 10 years, basically, of a focus on transnational feminist translation and translation studies, and more recently still, this collection which comes with the term decolonial feminist translation studies. And you think, how can you define what is decolonial? And it's not easy. I'll highlight the decolonial aspect with a review of this startling collection of articles on translation. Its foreword is written by Françoise Vergès. I don't know how many people recognize that name. She is quite a phenomenon. She's written a book called On Decolonial Feminism, or it's like a manifesto about decolonial feminism. She herself comes from Île de la Réunion and from a very political family. A few years ago, there was a film about her uncle, Vergès, who was a lawyer, a judge in France, and was busy somehow during the French-Algerian War, then looking at involved in law, in legal issues around Vichy, the Vichy regime, and punishments for the Vichy people, and then he disappeared for 8 years. Nobody knew exactly where he went, what he did, and so on. Superbly interesting background, also very mixed background, French and Vietnamese, but growing up in Île de la Réunion, and so on. So an example of decolonial life that many of us, me included, haven't experienced or don't really know much about. So she writes the foreword, the introduction. What's that? Oh, it turned off?
No, it's on, but it's...
Oh, it's not close enough. Okay. The introduction is by editor Nujat Abbas, focused on the politics of exile, deracination, migrancy, and life in diaspora. And these two set the tone for the discussion of translation in the essays that follow. And I'm particularly interested in how exile, or what they term exile, creates a decolonial feminist translation position. But first, feminism hit, quotation marks, translation studies just as this field was developing into an academic discipline in the 1980s. And feminist approaches and criticisms have had an impact on the production of translations by discussing what to translate, what not to translate, leave things aside that don't merit translation, by developing strategies of translation that make women visible. I mean, we've all talked about that. And dealing with grammar that is loaded on one side and tends to make women's activities and women's work and women's visibility invisible, by deploying and justifying the use of sometimes rather long paratext to explain what's going on in the text, what's going on with the feminist strategies at work, and drawing attention to them. And by so-called hijacking a text, people have loved that term about hijacking a text that needs serious adjustment if it is to go fit with and reflect feminist principles of the translator or the publishing house, which doesn't happen very often. And I'm going to briefly talk about that. Some of these principles and strategies continue to be in use and even more developed, most recently in the work of someone called Emily Rose. I don't know if anyone recognizes that name. She has devised special gender markings in English to render binary or non-binary and queer textual components. So if you read a text that she has translated, and she writes about this as well, there are little marks in the text to mark that particular word as referring to someone or something that is queer or deemed queer or non-binary. And then she explains her process and in a way apologizes for how complicated and how complex it makes the reading of such a text. But in general, it seems to me that these strategies have had limited applicability in other literatures and languages. I recently am currently supervising a PhD from Madrid Anne Irizar, who's actually from Basque country, and she's studying what happens with Basque texts where the language is not gendered. And when those texts are translated into Spanish, into Catalan, into Galician, and so on, in other words, into Romance languages, how the translators, who are often the authors of the original Basque text, deal with their characters. And what she has been finding is that gender suddenly applies in the most cliched, predictable ways. There's no language for this non-gendered Basque, and so gender is applied, and often in, like I said, in very cliched ways. Another PhD student is looking at the situation in Mexico, Argelia Peña, and finds that feminist work in actual translation projects, production of translation, is very rare, difficult to push through gatekeepers such as editors and publishers. They don't care about feminist strategies of translation or making women visible in texts and so on. Much of the early impetus for feminist translation strategies, in fact, developed in and from a very local situation. And more, I think it's important to consider the local aspects of certain theories and theorizations rather than assuming that they can apply very broadly. And this local situation has been described and misdescribed quite often, but basically it was found located in Canada, very, very bilingual political push, publishing houses that were being paid to publish translations, translators who were being paid to make translations, and so on, and where there was a lot of room for this kind of experimentation and this kind of development. Attempts to apply these strategies, however, more broadly, have not always met with much success. And here we can refer to Marilyn Booth, for instance, who's a prof in Oxford, who writes about the fact that her translation of Girls of Riyadh from Arabic to English was subsequently adjusted back to not reflect what the text actually had to say about girls in Riyadh, but what people in English, notably in the USA, would like to read about girls in Riyadh. And she was so helpless, the translator, professor at Oxford, still doesn't matter, so helpless in front of the power of the publishing houses and the power of the marketing people, that the text came out in a very humdrum, predictable way. So I think the most important impact of feminist ideas in regard to the production of translation has been the issue of selection, the impetus to look for, discover, and translate work by women writers, sometimes feminist, sometimes not, whose contributions to literary and other aspects of society have been disparaged or ignored or neglected or deliberately silenced. And I think we've been hearing about such translators and such work here today, or yesterday as well. This archaeological work, also the kind of work that Pascal has been doing in archives, has been and continues to be one of the most important aspects, I think, of this practical, pragmatic approach to translation from a feminist kind of perspective. On the other hand, feminist approaches to translation studies have developed in many ways. We now have reams of good qualitative research on women writers and translation, women's histories in translation, women translators and their visibility and influence, translations of influential cultural texts such as the Bible or the Quran. Right now the Quran is being retranslated by all kinds of, or reinterpreted by various educated women, and numerous revisions of existing translations, as well as quantitative research on who is translated, when and where, and who is reviewed by whom, when, and where. And I think the paper from Portugal showed that really well. So many women translators, so many men translators over the decades, and so on. This has become a very fruitful field of scholarly research. Further, these initiatives have moved well beyond literary work, which is really nice to see, to audiovisual translation, and the translations of the terminology, for instance, that's created by Hollywood scriptwriters. They are superbly inventive, and they create language, often, most recently around gender, that has to be translated, dubbed, and subtitled. And here in Italy, Irene Ranzato has written about that, how Italy has maybe 3 words for something where Hollywood has developed 20 words. So it's all very much reduced and not easy to handle. Delia Chiaro, I think, has worked on this as well here in Italy. So audiovisual translation has been very much a focus of feminist translation studies. United Nations texts and other NGO and international institutions, and the deployment of universalist American gender terminology, such as the term gender mainstreaming. I've written about that recently, about what it means. What does it mean? Nobody really knows. In international development projects, you have the word gender mainstreaming. You pay, or a country pays $8 million for a international development project with the attachment that gender mainstreaming must be part of it. But nobody really seems to know what exactly is gender mainstreaming, how to translate it into Burundi or into Rwanda or into some other development project. And then there's also been work on gender issues or feminist approaches to gender in AI applications and translation technologies, where machine translation will always find the pronoun he for doctor, she for nurse. Predictable, because ancient translations have been fed into the machine to provide it with its material. So, despite a short lull in feminist initiatives, at least in the Anglo-American environment, as queer, non-binary, and diverse other sexualities and genders took center stage in academia from the 2000s onward, and feminist endeavors were often assigned the term essentialist, research has now been picking up and spreading again, perhaps first and foremost to those countries and cultures less affected by the noisy gender talk, it's a term that you come across now and then, of Anglo-America. For instance, in China, in Egypt, in India, Argentina, Brazil, and so on. So, this next section, translation as an antidote to Anglo-American gender, as an antidote. So, often termed transnational feminist translation studies, these international developments may be viewed as an antidote to the Anglo-Americanization of the field. And I say that because I can observe over many years now how English has dominated translation studies, or seems to have dominated translation studies. Interestingly, this antidote may be aided by the likes of gender guru Judith Butler, who in 2019 published a paper entitled Gender in Translation, Beyond Monolingualism. And I have that paper here, it's very intense. The article is her response to what she sees as the increasing hostility in certain cultures to Anglo-American gender talk and the universalization of Anglo-American gender ideas. And she finally faces the fact that any application of Anglo-American gender terminology into other cultures and languages must go hand in hand with translation. She writes, without an understanding of translation, as in quotations, its practice and its limits, there can be no gender studies within a global framework. Without translation, there's no way to understand the dynamic and changing category of gender and the resistances it now encounters, now being 2019 or maybe 2018 when she wrote this. Well, finally, The Anglo-American gender talk that has affected feminism as well in many different ways and not always positively is being recognized as a local Anglo-American phenomenon that requires translation, interpretation, explanation, and adaptation before it can apply to other cultures and languages. Butler admits that, quote, Anglophone monolingualism too often assumes that English forms a sufficient basis for theoretical claims about gender, while in fact this local Anglo-American gender politics can be very much untranslatable into other languages. There's a German translator who's written about this. There's an Arabic in Egypt friend who's written about this. Or someone recently I came across some graduate students who were in Latvia from Bulgaria, who said that there is such a resistance in Bulgaria to these ideas that people on the street assign to gender, that if you appear a little bit odd, a little bit off the expected norm, they say, you're doing gender. Nobody knows exactly what this is. Butler announces gender is a foreign word. 2019, finally. And no one language has the exclusive power to define it or to regulate its grammatical usage. This is a somewhat belated discussion of how contingent the gender categories and related politics must be, a recognition that the current interest in transnational feminist translation and translation studies underscores. In other words, turning away from these complications of gender to transnational feminist translation. In 2014 already, Signs, a feminist studies journal in the US, published a special issue on translation where authors such as Claudia de Lima Costa and Silvia Alvarez from Brazil and Francine Descaries from Quebec explained the need for transnational work in the field in order to balance the destructive power of English. And they viewed and described transnational approaches as, one, recognizing and trying to mitigate the local colonialist aspects of Anglo-American European feminisms, local on the one hand to Anglo-American Europe, but colonialist in terms of trying to push them or pushing them into other cultures. Second, expanding or the need to expand or ignore borders and focus on women's solidarities. Third, bring new discourses into academia. For instance, a discourse around Islamic feminism, which I woke up to in 2016. I thought, wow, so interesting. Fourth, raising questions about from post and neo-colonialist perspectives about gender mainstreaming, for instance, in international development that I mentioned already. And more generally, incorporating the other, listening to the other, publishing, reading, and understanding the other. All in the name of welcoming feminist diversity, recognizing the impact of colonialism, racism, and capitalism, and all the intersections. So this huge, broad, intersectional agenda in translation studies was quickly followed up by books, articles, and publications focusing on women in translation beyond the Anglo-American Eurozone, so beyond the Italian one as well. I just thought about that this morning going over this. Here we are talking very much about Italian women writers and so on, and I'm talking about getting away from all that. Excuse me. So in Egypt, Hala Kamal wrote on the challenges of translating the local Anglo-American feminist studies into Arabic for contemporary readers. In China, Lili Yu published Translating Feminism in China, devoting at least one entire chapter to the difficulties involved in staging the vagina monologues in Shanghai. And both authors and many others pointing out how the local aspects of Anglo-American feminist and gender work do not translate immediately. All kinds of adaptation and explanation are required. In South America, 2 special issues of Mutatis Mutandis, which is a translation studies journal that comes from Colombia. We're dedicated to transnational feminist translation studies with articles published deliberately in Spanish, Portuguese, or English with abstracts, good abstracts. Often you get terrible abstracts with a foreign language text, but good abstracts in the other languages, so that people are encouraged to publish in Spanish, in Portuguese, and or English if they wish, and their work can be understood via the abstracts and then, if necessary, translated. Today, examples abound of the global majority, located in the global south, mobilizing and working with its own versions of feminism and gender ideas and on its own topics. So, the transnational, in its most positive definition, refers to boundary-ignoring, community and shared interest-based communicational activities between women, feminist women here, so the transnational feminists. This approach to translation studies reaches out to areas well beyond the more conventional fields of feminist translation studies. To give one example from a book that was compiled by Olga Castro and Emek Ergun, there's one article there that argues that there's an enormous importance and value in translating feminist documentary film from Tamil Nadu in southern India into Galician in Spain. So Tamil Nadu has a population of 72 million, and Galicia has a population of 4 million, and one can really understand such an argument. What a feminist organization from 72 million people might have to say could be of interest to a small minority group in Galicia. Whether ever a translator would be found to do that work of translating feminist documentary film is another question. Now, a brief account of my work and my development into that area. In 2011, I published Translating Women, a collection of articles on translating women with an introduction that looked at Judith Butler and Judith Butler's gender work, which, in my mind at least, had caused scholarly research to turn away from women, from feminism, and feminist concerns with language, and had very often, not Judith Butler herself, but other people who have applied and her work, have often ended up aligning feminists with the bad guys of patriarchy, those who are not only essentialist, but privileged and exploitative, and thus increasing the enlarged gender divides. For a while, it was very difficult to find books that had the word feminism on the top or in the cover. Just didn't exist. Inside, the book was all about women translators, women, there's one well-known book, women writing about migrancy and so on. No mention of women on the cover, no mention of feminism on the cover, but inside you realize it's all about women. But it was published in this time where there was this powerful push towards other genders being, and towards feminism being something that is essentialist. So there was little development for a certain amount of time. However, when I presented this book, 2011, at a conference in Cordoba, a colleague, my friend Chris Larkosh, said, "Oh, it's very interesting, but it's so Eurocentric." I thought, whoa, yeah, it was. Every article in the book had a European or Anglo-American topic or writer or translator, and did not move beyond this really enclave, you could power base in a way. So the next project was done in collaboration with a colleague in Iran, as far away from the Anglo-American Eurozone as I could get, Farzaneh, and in order to show how non-Eurocentric feminist translation studies can be. And that book, Translating Women, Other Voices and New Horizons, included work from Iran about women's development as translators over the 20th century, from being 90% illiterate at the beginning of the century to doing hundreds of works in translation by the end of the century, and tracing that development. From Mexico, about a project to translate indigenous women's poetry written in Nahuatl and other indigenous languages into Canadian indigenous languages such as Cree and Algonquin. And then the role that the colonizing languages play as a pivot language. So you translate from Nahuatl into Spanish, from Spanish into English, from English into Cree, say. Making it very obvious how distant those indigenous languages are, yet how many people still use them. From Hong Kong, there was an article. From Saudi Arabia, the one about girls of Riyadh. From Morocco, my first exposure to a feminist organization that works on Islamic feminism and on making the ideas of Islamic feminism available in French and English via translation, and running into all kinds of problems about what can be translated and how in such an environment where there's still a very strong religious pushback. And then at the same time, another book, the book by Olga Castro and Emek Ergun came out. So there's a very big move towards getting out of the Anglo-American Eurozone of feminist translation and moving beyond into what is really very interesting in other locations. So intellectually, and in terms of both expanding and decolonializing feminisms, listening to and learning from the feminisms that other cultures develop, seems attractive and makes a lot of sense. The global majority has interesting and different things to say, opening up new horizons, new knowledge that those of us immersed in the Anglo-American zone can benefit from. And here, not only as friendly editors, which sometimes I felt that I was, allowing papers from Morocco and from Hong Kong and giving them an opportunity to publish in English and so on. So I think it's good to move away from that and not only be the friendly editor and purveyor of space and time, that our institutions allow us, our universities with our university money, but in order to really engage and learn about how widespread feminist ideas of all sorts and types have been for ages in all cultures of the world, and how specific to these cultures they may be. For me, Islamic feminism was one that I discovered in the editing of that one book. But so was the resonance of a 2,000-year-old collection of Buddhist texts written by Buddhist nuns called Therigatha, the Therigatha, a collection of ancient texts, where a colleague who is in Sri Lanka and who can read those texts in the original language sees clear parallels to what those nuns were writing 2,000 years ago with 20th-century Simone de Beauvoir approaches and understanding of what makes a woman's life more difficult or something to be struggled against. So here we have 2,000-year-old Buddhist nuns text and Beauvoir, and the parallels are right there. So these transnational ideas were further expanded then in the collection that you also mentioned, the Routledge Handbook, which I did together with Hela Kamal in Egypt, where 36 of 41 articles were written by people who didn't have English as their first language. So very, very international in a way, with work from Yemen, that was superb, on the labor of underpaid, highly educated women subtitlers who subtitle American material and TV series for Arabic networks, but have to censor and remove anything that might be deemed feminist while they're doing their work. Yeah, work from Egypt on the feminization of directions for use on cleaning products, because Arabic, unlike English, marks all the genders as male or female, and on the directions for use of Javex, for instance, bleach or other cleaning products is always in feminine, for feminine use. Work from Chile that was very interesting, that foregrounds the presence in South America and South American literature of the nana. The nana is a indigenous babysitter, live-in mama, basically, who looks after, who is indigenous, therefore dark-skinned often, who looks after the white children of upper-class families and devotes her entire life to them. How do you translate that? Is she the babysitter? Is she the nanny? Is she the au pair? Or do you need to write at least a page discussing what is the role of the nana as she grows older as well? The kids grow up, the nana stays, the nana looks after the mother of the house, all kinds of strange, for us, relationships that cannot be caught in just one word, the babysitter. Oh. So, in the example from Chile and many others from the global south, it has become evident that transnational feminist translation studies involve explanation, cultural translation, adaptation, and work in this field triggers personal responses, personal interests, personal histories and emotions, which I now want to refer to in regard to this book here, where Gita Sukumaran, one of the 11 women authors, writes as follows on exactly this topic. She's Tamil, and she sees translation as, quote, creative retelling, never marred by notions of loss of the original or by anxiety surrounding the act of translation. Translation in the cultures of South Asia can summarize, expand, retell in various creative ways, unhampered by the diktat of fidelity or faithfulness that has determined Western translation for centuries, where our translations can hardly go over the word limit in a way. It almost has to be exact. And people have talked about this, not very much, but I have seen claims that it dates, this tendency in the West or in Europe dates from Bible translations, where if the Bible translations weren't done to an exact requirement, the Bible translator could be removed. And that has affected the way we think of translations, whereas we know that translations require explanation, adaptation, cultural translation, which you can see when you look at this material from the Global South, where such translation is the norm. And there are all kinds of terms in this book that refer to the words in Urdu, in Gujarati, and in Tamil, for instance, for translation, which always mean this bigger act of explaining that is perfectly acceptable. So, a couple of issues that are related to this very recent collection of essays on translation by women from the Global South, and which approach the question of translation as work done in exile, from a minoritized diasporic standpoint. In Françoise Vergès' introduction and the 11 essays on translation and so on, she writes of her life experience in regard to a native tongue. She wonders if she ever had such a thing. Do we? How many of us wonder if we ever had a native tongue? Vergès writes, I cannot say that I have a native tongue, as I circulate among Creole, French, and English, and each language has its own status, role, and place in my life. French, for her, is the language of the colonizers of Île de la Réunion in the Indian Ocean, where she grew up, the language that contemptuously repressed the languages of the colonies. Creole was the language forged in resistance and our language of intimacy, she writes, but forbidden at school and in the media and seen as a mere dialect. English, the other imperial language, she quote, which she learned as an adult, has, ironically, allowed her to write more freely about colonial slavery, racism, feminism, France Fanon, and decolonization. Still, English, she says, is no better than French, having crushed other languages, been the language of racist laws and domination, and having become the language of capitalist globalization. her book, Decolonial Feminism, is full of this kind of angry language. The question of language and which language to use, when and how, is therefore crucial in this decolonial space. Vergès brings her personal life story into the introduction and the effects of the profusion and hierarchization of languages in our globalized situation today, and she politicizes the identity issues that come with a lack of a native tongue and a place as an important part of decolonial feminism. This sets the tone for the rest of the book. So the issue of an unrecognized or colonially devalued native tongue resonates in every essay. For those writers born and raised in diaspora, the native language is fragmented and only partially there. They need to refer to mothers, fathers, older community members to learn and understand. And for the older people living in diaspora, language is part of their history, the history of their community, and they see it as their duty, responsibility to maintain it, transfer it, explain to those born in diaspora. Language, however partial and mixed, is identity. So they're torn with this language issue. The younger ones who are interested, who are linguists, some of them here are maybe 30 years old when they're writing, only know little bits and fragments of the language, and they want to go back and learn more of it and more of what it means and so on. But they only have a few older folks that they can refer to. And the older folks, the older translators and so on, feel this responsibility to the younger ones to explain to them what happened and to try to teach the language. In writing my review essay, I dedicated it to my mother, by the way, who lived in exile in Canada for 70 years before she died at age 94. She arrived in Canada when she was, 24, 25. She always said, I'm living in exile. And in a way, we had the same problem, that she forced us all to learn German, but it was an old-fashioned German, which when I go to Germany and speak it, sometimes people wonder where I'm from. And on the other hand, it worked with maybe 2 of her children, not all of them. And so there's this push and pull between languages, which in our case was not so serious because we were white and could fit in very nicely into Canadian society. But what comes with these women here is that they're dark, and the color makes a big difference. So these decolonial translators here recognize, even though they know that their own language is only there in fragments, they recognize and know that colonial languages, English, French, Portuguese, Spanish, also Arabic, remain vital tools in their lives as translators. They work between the languages, like that example from Mexico to colonial language to other indigenous language. So even though they want to maintain or get back to their own language, they have to accept the existing colonial languages and recognize that, yeah, there's value there. Yeah. So what about the question of exile, briefly? The first place where language learning and translation take place is in the diasporic home in Hamilton, Ontario, in Toronto, Ontario, somewhere they describe it in the gray urban deserts of the north, where the home language competes with the language outside and largely loses out to English. These translators, all living and working in diaspora, reference home as the source and only reference for their identity and language. So whether they want to maintain Gujarati or learn Urdu, it has to happen at home. It doesn't happen anywhere else. This language is a vital organism, but it's very fragile. So second, the generational aspect of life in diaspora is important. Like I said, Tamil, Urdu, Gujarati, Rwandese, for example, are kept alive by these translators as they often work for the sake of the next generation, cousins, siblings, offspring, grandchildren, for whom they feel responsible, if only to explain why they have all ended up in exile. And then third, the political aspects of knowing the home or other minoritized languages are important, especially after 9/11. 3 or 4 of the 11 articles refer to the effects of 9/11 on young Muslims growing up in North America, who, if they were linguists and who, if they were interested in language, turned towards Arabic and learnt Arabic, and are now, at least 1 or 2 of them, translating from Arabic, even writing in Arabic, and realizing, one of them, that Arabic too is a colonialist language and has imposed itself across large parts of the Middle East and beyond. And finally, life in exile, in diaspora, in the colonialist language of English, raises disturbing questions about home. What happened? Why? How were so many forced into exile? And then things get very uncomfortable. They describe how uncomfortable it is to talk to the older generation and ask, what happened? And nobody wants to come out and talk about the Rwandan massacres that happened in 1992 or 93, what's going on in Haiti right now. One of the authors translates a Haitian writer, and so on. And there's a whole history of silencing the stories that brought them into exile, of shame, of embarrassment, of just sadness at having to relive that, perhaps. So this dire situation is ascribed largely, and we know this now, to the damages wrought by colonialization, and especially the lifting of the colonial powers over the course of the 20th century, the ensuing poverty, the educational void, missionary influences, as well as the internecine struggles and killings, Rwanda, Haiti, and so on, are all referenced in these texts. But so is the effect of a culture, and this applies specifically to the Saudi author here, who says that once Saudi Arabia, that area, was freed of colonial powers, the new local government sought to assert its own values and developed its obsession with women, who are the center of public discourse, all the things that they can't do and shouldn't do and should do and so on, although their voices are silenced. She says, all in effect of those Arab lands coming out of colonization and seeking to define themselves. Now, finally, translating in exile and living in exile means hard work, discomfort, lack of recognition, despite the command that these writers have and exhibit of many languages. And so Baroka from Indonesia often interrupts her essay to ask the reader how they are feeling. Are they well? Do they need to move around and get some exercise? When you think you spend the whole day sitting in front of a computer, do you think you need to get up and move a little bit, or perhaps have a drink? Have they spent too much time on the screen? Are they getting paid enough for their work? All these questions come up in this one essay. It's very, very odd or interesting. Anyways, these essays, fascinating for the array of languages they deal with, all kinds of material from Tamil and from Gujarati and so on, that little words, little expressions that they then explain, for the histories they reference, the difficulties in their homelands that the writers evoke, and the life between language that they describe, or between languages. But also for the presence of translation in their childhoods, their colonized lives, their education, and in fact, in their entire lives. Translation for them is a way of life, a way of being, a complex, challenging, engagingly interesting, when they write about it, aspect of lives lived in diaspora, in exile, and where questions of belonging, identity, academic qualification, responsibility to the next generation, and skin color abound, so on. So that's really what I have to say. And I wonder how much of it would apply in Italy. I attended one conference a few years ago where there was some discussion about translators working on Lampedusa, and the problems that they face or that are faced not only by the people who land on the island, but then by the translators who have to work between them and the migration officers and the police and so on, and how the translators are often people who themselves landed on Lampedusa a few years earlier and are brought in to deal, and let alone whoever else. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
Thank you so much, Luis. I think your talk is a brilliant testimony of your intellectual engagement, and also the importance of everyone should be encouraged to reconsider one's own position, one's own assumption and reflection. Yeah. I think there were a lot of issue at stake in your presentation, starting from the trouble of gender, moving to the fact that also concept that we considered that don't need explanation, they are not neutral term, like translation itself and native language, and also we discussed a lot even yesterday about the concept of fidelity, but everything has been put in relative. I'm sorry.
I think it's been relativized.
Relativized by the perspective of these scholars coming from other backgrounds and other cultures. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Don't know whether we have a space for a couple of questions, or shall we?
I don't know what time it is.
We move to the coffee break, and maybe we can carry on with the discussion there in front of a coffee. Thank you so much, Louise.
Yeah.